We like to think intelligence is ours, that the capacity to plan, to communicate, to reshape the world around you, those things belong to creatures with brains, with neurons, with something we can point to and say, there, that is where the thinking happens. But what if I told you that planet Earth was already being managed, intelligently, systematically, on a planetary scale, long before the first neuron ever fired? Not by dinosaurs, not by our ancestors, not by anything we would recognize as an animal at all. Fungi and plants. That is what did it. And they did not just survive. They engineered this world. They rewrote the atmosphere. They built the soil beneath your feet. They invented biological communication networks so sophisticated that we are still, right now, in the 21st century, struggling to fully understand them. Before we get down to business, please subscribe to this channel. Your support makes it possible for us to continue this work, and we are genuinely grateful for it. Thank you. Now, let us go back, way back, to a time when none of this existed. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. What is intelligence, really? We use the word constantly. We say someone made an intelligent decision, or that a system responds intelligently to its environment, or that a particular animal is surprisingly intelligent. But when you strip away the assumptions, when you stop requiring that intelligence come packaged inside a skull, the definition gets slippery in a very interesting way. The standard answer goes something like this. Intelligence is the ability to perceive information from your environment, process it, and respond in a way that increases your chances of survival or success. That sounds reasonable. It sounds like brains. But here is the thing. Nothing in that definition actually requires a brain. Nothing in it requires neurons, or a central nervous system, or consciousness, or anything we would call thought. What it requires is information processing. Input, computation, output. And it turns out that life figured out how to do information processing roughly 1.7 billion years before it figured out how to build a brain. Think about the size of that gap. 1.7 billion years. For reference, the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. We are talking about a head start more than 25 times longer than that. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where it is easy to slide from science into poetry, and while poetry has its place, this video is not the place for it. What I'm going to describe to you today is not metaphor. It is not analogy. It is the documented, peer-reviewed, measurable behavior of actual organisms, confirmed through decades of fieldwork and laboratory experiments by researchers at major universities around the world. The language we use to describe that behavior is still being debated. Scientists argue about whether words like intelligence and communication and decision-making are appropriate when applied to organisms without nervous systems. Those are legitimate debates, but the behaviors themselves are not in question. This video is about those behaviors, about what fungi and plants actually do, not what we romantically imagine they might do. And I promise you, what they actually do is more interesting than the romance. It is also When you follow the thread all the way out to its full historical and planetary implications, genuinely unsettling in a way I find productive, because it forces a reckoning with some assumptions about our own species that we tend not to examine too carefully. We are going to move through approximately 500 million years in this video. That is a long journey, and I want to make sure you feel the scale of it, not just intellectually, but viscerally. So let me give you one number before we begin. A number to carry with you through everything that follows. The Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Complex life, life with multiple cells and differentiated structures, has existed for something like 600 million years. Anatomically modern humans have existed for about 300,000 years. If you compress the history of complex life on Earth into a single calendar year, with the first complex animals appearing on January 1st and today being December 31st, then anatomically modern humans appear at roughly 11:58 in the evening on December 31st. We have been here for 2 minutes. The organisms we are going to talk about today have been here since late February. That is the scale we are working with. Keep it in mind. It changes everything. Picture the Earth roughly 450 million years ago. Not the lush, green, oxygen-rich planet you know. Something far more austere, far more hostile, far more alien in its appearance. The continents are arranged differently. Gondwana, a supercontinent encompassing what will eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, dominates the southern hemisphere. A slow, massive landmass that is itself in the process of gradual drift. The northern landmasses are scattered and relatively low-lying. The seas are shallow in many areas. Volcanic activity is frequent. The sky is a color you might not recognize. The atmosphere has less oxygen than today, more carbon dioxide, a different chemical balance. And the land, the actual surface of the land, is bare rock, grey, brown, weathered by wind and water, but not by life. No trees, no grass, no shrubs, no soil in any meaningful sense of the word. What exists instead is bare mineral surface, occasionally dusted with the thin bacterial mats that had been the primary land colonizers for hundreds of millions of years already. Those bacterial films are important. They begin the slow work of weathering rock. But they do not build the rich, layered, biologically active soil that makes complex land life possible. The oceans are a different story entirely. The Great Cambrian explosion had already happened, roughly 90 million years earlier. The Ordovician seas are full of life. Trilobites in enormous variety, early mollusks, echinoderms, coral-like structures, primitive, jawless fish just beginning to diversify. The ocean is doing fine, ecologically speaking. In fact, the Ordovician Ocean is, in terms of biological diversity, quite remarkable. Reef-like structures built by organisms called bryozoans and rugose corals cover significant areas of the shallow seafloor. Cephalopods, distant ancestors of the modern squid and nautilus, reach lengths of nearly 30 feet, making them among the largest predators in the history of life at that point. Sea scorpions, several feet long, prowl the shallow waters. The ocean is alive with a complexity and variety that would, if you could somehow transplant yourself there and look down through the water seem almost familiar in its general structure. Predators, filter feeders, bottom dwellers, free swimmers, even if the specific organisms were unlike anything alive today. All of that life, all of that evolutionary complexity, all of that biological richness, it is confined to the water. Step onto the land and it stops. Completely. The shoreline is a border more absolute than any we have ever drawn on a map. On one side, an ocean teeming with hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history. On the other side, essentially bare rock extending as far as you could walk in any direction. That border was about to move, and then something lands on that bare rock. And then something lands on that bare rock. Something that, to any reasonable observer standing there at the time, would seem utterly insignificant. So insignificant that you might not even notice it. Fungi. Not the mushrooms you are picturing. No caps, no stems, nothing visible above the surface. What we are talking about are fungal filaments, structures thinner than a human hair, called hyphae, that spread across and into the surface of bare rock, dissolving minerals with chemical secretions, extracting what they need and growing, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, century by century. Now, the word fungus tends to produce a fairly unimpressive mental image. You might think of mold on bread, or mushrooms on a pizza, or perhaps the powdery white coating on a dying plant. That mental image is going to need a complete overhaul by the time we are done here, because fungi are not plants. They are not animals. They belong to their own kingdom. A kingdom that is, genetically speaking, actually more closely related to animals than to plants, which surprises most people when they first encounter it. Fungi and animals share a common ancestor that plants do not share with either of them. We are, in the most technical phylogenetic sense, closer to a mushroom than a mushroom is to a fern. But more importantly for our story, fungi operate by a set of rules entirely unlike anything else on Earth. Plants make their own food through photosynthesis, pulling energy from sunlight and carbon from the air. Animals eat other organisms, digesting them internally. Fungi do something stranger. They digest their food externally. They secrete enzymes into whatever material surrounds them: rock, wood, soil, a dead leaf, another living organism. Break it down chemically outside their own bodies and then absorb the resulting nutrients through the surfaces of their filaments. They are, in essence, stomachs turned inside out. Their entire body is a digestive surface. This peculiar biology made them uniquely suited for the most difficult environment on Earth at that time: bare rock with essentially no organic material and no established biological community to compete with. They could extract phosphorus and other minerals directly from stone in ways that nothing else could. They could survive complete desiccation, drying out entirely, and then resume full metabolic activity when water returned. They could tolerate temperature extremes that would rapidly destroy most other organisms. They could grow through rock along microscopic cracks, prying at it chemically and physically simultaneously. On that barren Ordovician landscape, fungi were the pioneers. Not in a metaphorical sense. Literally, the first complex organisms to colonize the terrestrial surface of this planet in significant numbers and begin the transformation of bare rock into something that could eventually support larger life. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Fungi, for all their chemical genius, cannot photosynthesize. They cannot make their own food from sunlight. They require organic carbon, carbon that comes from living or once living material. On bare rock, that carbon was scarce, almost non-existent. At roughly the same time, small photosynthetic organisms, early relatives of modern land plants, something like primitive liverworts, were also making tentative forays onto the land surface from coastal environments where they had been evolving for some time. They could capture sunlight. They could pull carbon dioxide from the air and fix it into sugar. But they had a different and equally serious problem. Bare rock offers almost no usable nutrients. No nitrogen in an accessible form. No phosphorus in an accessible form. Without those things, photosynthesis alone cannot sustain meaningful growth. You can capture all the sunlight you want, but if you cannot build the proteins and nucleic acids that growth requires, the energy is useless. Two organisms, two complementary problems, two complementary solutions. What happened next was not planned. It was not a conscious arrangement of any kind. It was chemistry finding its equilibrium. Two different organisms with two different needs, discovering that proximity to each other was mutually beneficial, and over many generations, evolving to formalize that proximity into a relationship. The fungal filaments made contact with the photosynthetic cells of the early land plants, and instead of simply digesting them, something else occurred, an exchange. The fungus provided minerals, phosphorus pulled from the rock through its remarkable chemical capabilities, nitrogen compounds, trace elements essential for growth, and in return received sugars produced through photosynthesis, carbon for minerals, captured sunlight for dissolved stone. This arrangement is called mycorrhiza. The word comes from the Greek for fungus and root, and it is, without any exaggeration at all, one of the most consequential biological partnerships in the history of this planet. It changed everything that came after it. Today, right now, as you watch this, somewhere between 80 and 90% of all land plant species on Earth maintain mycorrhizal relationships with fungi. Not some plants, not most plants in certain habitats, nearly all land plants everywhere. The oak tree in your neighborhood park is connected to fungi. The grass in your yard, the wheat in your bread, the corn in your breakfast cereal, the soybeans, the rice, the potatoes. Almost every crop that feeds the 8 billion people currently living on this planet is sustained, in part, by a fungal partnership that originated on bare rock 450 million years ago. We did not invent agriculture. We inherited a biological system that was already running before our ancestors were fish. Those early plant-fungus partnerships, humble and microscopic as they were, began doing something that would have enormous consequences. They began to make soil. As fungal filaments dissolved minerals from rock and mixed them with dead organic matter, the shed cells of the photosynthetic partners, the remains of other small organisms, the chemical byproducts of their own metabolism. The first true soil began to accumulate. Not much at first. A thin film, a few millimeters, perhaps a centimeter in the most favorable spots beside water. But it was there, and it was alive. And where soil exists, more life follows. More life means more organic matter. More organic matter means deeper soil. Deeper soil means more water retention. More water retention means more plant growth. More plant growth means more photosynthesis. More photosynthesis means more oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere. What we are watching in slow motion across millions of years is a positive feedback loop of extraordinary power. A self-amplifying biological engine that, once started, could not easily be stopped. And the fungi were the ones who started it running. The Devonian period is sometimes called the Age of Fishes, and that name is not inaccurate. The oceans during this period saw an extraordinary diversification of fish, including the first sharks, the first ray-finned fish, and the first lobe-finned fish that would eventually evolve into all four-limbed vertebrates, a lineage that eventually includes you. If you want to find your deep aquatic ancestors, the Devonian is where to look. But from the perspective of planetary history, the ocean is almost beside the point during this period. Because on land, during the Devonian, something happened that changed the chemistry of this planet permanently and irreversibly. Plants invented the tree. That sentence sounds simple. It is not simple in any way. The evolution of large, woody, upright land plants is capable of reaching heights of 30, 40, 50 feet was a biological revolution whose planetary consequences are genuinely difficult to overstate. Before the Devonian, land plants were small, low and spreading, like modern mosses and liverworts, or slightly taller but still modest in scale. Ferns and early horsetails reaching knee height or perhaps waist height at most. They covered considerable ground, those early plants, but they did not dominate the vertical dimension of the landscape. The sky above the land surface was essentially empty. If you had stood on the shore of a Silurian continent and looked inland, what you would have seen is something like a vast green carpet with no significant vertical structure above a few feet. Then, over the course of roughly 40 million years in the Devonian and early Carboniferous, that changed. And the key to the change was a single molecule, lignin. Lignin is a complex organic polymer, a long, tangled, three-dimensional molecule that plants evolved to provide structural rigidity to their tissues. It is what makes wood hard. It is what allows a tree trunk to stand upright under its own weight, to resist the force of wind, to support the enormous canopy of leaves above it. A molecule of lignin is woven through the cell walls of wood in a way that makes those walls incredibly strong and almost impossibly resistant to chemical breakdown. If cellulose, the other main structural molecule in plants, is like plain cotton fabric, then lignin is like that cotton fabric soaked in epoxy resin and allowed to cure. Rigid, durable, extremely difficult to dissolve. Lignin allowed plants to build upward, to reach toward the light above their competitors, to invest in vertical growth rather than lateral spreading. Once the first plants evolved effective lignin synthesis, which happened in multiple lineages during the Devonian, an evolutionary arms race began that transformed the landscape within, geologically speaking, a very short time. Plants that could grow taller got more light. Plants that got more light grew faster and reproduced more successfully. The selection pressure for height, once it began, was intense and self-reinforcing. By roughly 360 million years ago, as we cross from the Devonian into the Carboniferous, the first great forests covered vast portions of the land surface. And these are not forests like any that exist today. These are genuinely alien landscapes. The dominant trees of the early Carboniferous were members of a group called Lycopsids, scale trees, technically, though the name barely captures how strange they actually were. Lepidodendron, the most famous genus, grew to nearly 100 feet in height. Its trunk was covered in diamond-shaped scars where leaves had attached and then fallen away as the tree grew. A pattern unlike anything on a modern tree. It did not branch the way modern trees branch. Instead, it rose as a single trunk and then forked repeatedly near the very top into a cluster of leaf-bearing branches. It reproduced by spores, not seeds. If you encountered one today, you would not immediately recognize it as a tree at all. Alongside the Lycopsids grew giant horsetails reaching 40 feet and enormous tree ferns, and the first seed plants just beginning to evolve at the margins of these forests. The whole landscape was dense, humid, steaming. The Carboniferous world sat mostly near the equator, where the climate was tropical. The air was wet and thick with moisture and oxygen and the chemical effluent of an enormous, productive, ancient ecosystem. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these forests, roughly 300 million years ago. The first thing you notice is the scale. The trees around you rise to nearly 100 feet, but their trunks are relatively uniform in diameter, almost all the way up, covered in that geometric pattern of diamond-shaped scales. They look, in some ways, more like enormous asparagus than trees. The forest floor beneath them is deep in organic material, not the rich, dark humus of a modern deciduous forest, but a thick, fibrous accumulation of partially decomposed plant matter. Something that would become, hundreds of millions of years later, the coal seams of England and Pennsylvania and the Ruhr Valley. And then something moves, and you realize that the insects here are not the scale you are accustomed to. The dragonfly that just settled on a nearby trunk has a wingspan wider than your outstretched arms. The centipede-like creature working its way along the forest floor is 8 feet long. Everything is larger. Everything is strange. And all of it, the giant trees, the giant insects, the deep accumulation of undecayed carbon on the forest floor, is a consequence of a single enzymatic gap in the metabolic capabilities of fungi. Because all of this wood, all of this lignin, was being produced at an extraordinary rate. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of forest, each tree producing tons of lignin-rich wood over its lifetime, falling when it died and piling up on the forest floor, sinking into the swamps and shallow coastal waters. And it was not decomposing. Remember the fungi. Remember those patient, chemically sophisticated organisms that had been building soil and running mycorrhizal networks for tens of millions of years. They were still there, still doing all of that. But lignin was new in the world, chemically unlike anything that had existed in significant quantities before. And the fungi, despite their remarkable enzymatic toolkit, despite hundreds of millions of years of chemical evolution, had not yet evolved the specific suite of enzymes needed to efficiently break lignin apart. This seems almost impossible. We are talking about organisms that can digest rock, that can break down some of the most chemically resistant materials on Earth. And they could not digest wood. But lignin is genuinely extraordinary in its chemical resistance. It is not a simple long-chain molecule. It is a three-dimensional polymer with an almost random branching structure that makes it resistant to the same kinds of enzymatic attack that work on simpler molecules. Breaking lignin efficiently requires a very specific combination of oxidative enzymes, peroxidases and lacases, that operate through a free radical mechanism quite different from most biological digestion. Evolving that specific toolkit took time. It did not happen quickly, and for several tens of millions of years, it had not happened at all. The result was a situation with no precedent in Earth's history. Dead plant material was accumulating faster than it could decompose. The fallen trunks and branches and leaf litter of the Carboniferous forests were being buried under sediment before they had time to rot. And the carbon inside them, carbon that had been pulled from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, carbon that in a normal ecosystem would have been returned to the air when decomposers broke down the dead material, was being locked underground. Millions of years, hundreds of millions of trees, all of that carbon buried. You know where this is going. That buried carbon is coal. The coal seams that powered the Industrial Revolution. The coal that still generates electricity in dozens of countries today. When you burn coal, you are releasing carbon dioxide that was pulled from the Carboniferous atmosphere by trees, locked away underground during a period when fungi could not digest lignin, and has been sitting there for roughly 300 million years. You are, in a very literal and precise sense, reversing a 300 million year old geochemical process in a matter of centuries. The speed of that reversal is entirely without precedent in Earth's history. But there is a more immediate consequence that matters for our story. As carbon was being removed from the system by burial, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels dropped dramatically. And as carbon dioxide dropped, oxygen rose. The plants were still photosynthesizing, still releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, but the carbon byproduct, instead of being returned to the air when organisms decomposed, was being sealed in the ground. The oxygen kept accumulating. At the peak of this process, roughly 310 to 300 million years ago, atmospheric oxygen may have reached somewhere between 30 and 35%. Today, the atmosphere is 21% oxygen. In the late Carboniferous, it may have been 60 to 70% higher than that. The consequences are written into the fossil record with remarkable clarity. Insects, which breathe through tubes called tracheae, and are normally limited in size by how far oxygen can passively diffuse through those tubes, were freed from their usual size constraints. Dragonflies with wingspans exceeding 2 feet. Millipede-like arthropods reaching 8 feet in length. scorpions the size of small dogs, a world of enormous primitive arthropods whose dimensions were set ultimately by whether fungi had found the right enzyme. The coal forests persisted for roughly 60 million years. Then the climate began to shift. The vast, shallow seas that had kept much of the land warm and humid retreated. The climate dried. The great forests fragmented. And simultaneously, or perhaps as a contributing cause to that fragmentation, fungi were closing the enzymatic gap. White rot fungi, carrying the new lignin-breaking toolkit, were spreading through the world's forests. Decomposition rates were rising. The carbon burial rate was declining. The oxygen spike was beginning to reverse. A new equilibrium was being established. The fungi had not just been passive observers. They had been, through their own evolutionary timeline, acting as an unconscious planetary regulator. First, enabling plant colonization of land. Then, by failing to digest lignin, inadvertently triggering a massive atmospheric transformation. Then, by eventually solving the lignin problem, helping to stabilize the atmosphere. No intention, no plan, no consciousness of any kind. Just chemistry and evolution and time. And the result was the air you are breathing at this moment. By the time the Permian period arrived, roughly 299 million years ago, the world was already fundamentally different from the coal forests we just left. The great lycopsid forests were gone. The giant insects were shrinking. Seed plants, gymnosperms, the ancestors of modern conifers, were diversifying rapidly and spreading into new habitats that the spore-bearing plants had never colonized efficiently. The soil was deeper than it had been in the Devonian, far more complex, far more biologically active. The mycorrhizal networks had been running for 150 million years by this point. 150 million years. That is more time than has passed since the first flowering plants appeared. The networks had survived the drawdown of carbon dioxide during the Carboniferous. They had survived the oxygen spike. They had survived the fragmentation of the coal forests. They were, by any reasonable measure, the most stable biological system on land. And then, the end Permian extinction arrived, 252 million years ago. The worst thing that ever happened to complex life on this planet. The cause was, in essence, volcanic. The Siberian Traps, a volcanic province in what is now Russia, erupted over a period of roughly 1 million years, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide in quantities that dwarfed anything a human civilization could produce. The global mean temperature rose by perhaps 10 degrees Celsius. The ocean chemistry changed. The oxygen content of deeper ocean water dropped to near zero. Acid rain fell on the continents. The ozone layer was partially destroyed. 96% of marine species were lost. 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Entire ecosystems that had existed for hundreds of millions of years simply collapsed. The recovery took roughly 10 million years, longer than the entire tenure of Homo sapiens multiplied by 30. But the fungi were there when it ended. The mycorrhizal networks, damaged, reduced, their plant partners decimated, began rebuilding the moment conditions allowed. The seed plants that had diversified in the Permian expanded explosively into the recovery landscape. New partnerships formed. The network rebuilt itself, and the world that emerged from the end Permian recovery was, in important ways, recognizably modern. Conifers, ferns, a complex network of mycorrhizal connections underlying them. A soil ecosystem that, though young by the standards of what preceded it, was already running the same fundamental logic that had governed terrestrial ecosystems for 200 million years before. It is worth pausing here, 250 million years ago, and recognizing what the mycorrhizal network had already accomplished. It had colonized bare rock. It had built soil. It had enabled the diversification of land plants. It had inadvertently engineered the most extreme oxygen spike in complex life's history. It had survived the worst mass extinction the planet has ever experienced. And it was already, at this point, 200 million years old. We have been here for 300,000 years. I want you to carry that contrast into the next part of our story, because it is the essential context for everything that follows. Let me describe a forest to you, not as you normally think about it, as a collection of individual trees, each competing for light and resources, each a separate organism pursuing its own survival. Forget that image. It is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. The forest you are picturing has another dimension. Underground, beneath the root systems of every tree, there is a network of fungal filaments so dense and so extensive that a single teaspoon of healthy forest soil contains miles of them. Miles. In a teaspoon. The network connects tree to tree across acres, sometimes across an entire forest, passing chemical signals, nutrients, water, and what some researchers now cautiously describe as information. This network, the mycorrhizal network, operates on a logic that has no good parallel in human technology, which is partly why it took so long for science to recognize it for what it is. We kept looking for the thing that was running it. The central processor, the hub. We kept expecting it to look like a telephone exchange or a computer server with some central node directing traffic. It does not work that way. The mycorrhizal network is what engineers call a distributed system. There is no center. There is no hub. There is no command structure. The network processes information, nutrients, chemical signals, electrical pulses, simultaneously across all of its connections with no single point of control. It is, in its architecture, something like the internet, which is exactly why researchers gave it that name. The Wood Wide Web, not a nickname invented by a science journalist. The actual term used in peer-reviewed literature. But here is what makes it truly remarkable. The network does not just passively transmit, it actively modulates. It can, under certain conditions, preferentially route resources toward trees that are stressed, trees in shade, trees that are sick, trees that have been damaged. Studies conducted over the past 2 decades, most notably by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard and her colleagues at the University of British Columbia, have documented carbon transfer through mycorrhizal networks, from large established trees to younger seedlings growing in low-light conditions beneath the canopy. In one set of experiments, researchers tracked radioactive carbon isotopes from tagged trees and found that the labeled carbon appeared in neighboring seedlings that had no direct physical connection to the source tree, only the fungal network connecting them underground. The seedlings were, in effect, receiving a subsidy from their larger neighbors, rooted through the fungal network. The large tree had more carbon than it needed at that moment. The seedling had less than it needed. The carbon moved between them, following concentration gradients through the biological cable that connected them. This is not altruism in any human sense. We should be careful here. The large tree is not choosing to help the seedling. The fungus is not deciding to be generous. What is happening is that chemical gradients, differences in concentration of sugars and minerals across the network, drive passive flow. Resources move from high concentration to low concentration, the way water flows downhill. And the result is a kind of biological redistribution that happens to look, from the outside, like deliberate sharing. But here is the philosophical wrinkle that makes this genuinely uncomfortable if you think about it carefully enough. What is the difference, functionally speaking, between a system that decides to share resources and a system that shares resources? If the outcome is identical, does the presence or absence of intention actually matter, practically speaking? I am going to leave that question open because it deserves more than a quick answer. What happens when a tree is under attack is where the story becomes significantly stranger. When a plant is attacked by an herbivore, an insect eating its leaves, for instance, a cascade of biochemical events begins almost instantly. Enzymes that were previously separated from their substrates by cell membranes come into contact with those substrates and produce signaling molecules. Jasmonic acid is one of the most important of these, sometimes called the plant equivalent of adrenaline, though that analogy simplifies things considerably. Jasmonic acid and related compounds travel through the plant's vascular tissue, activating defensive gene expression in cells that have not yet been damaged. The plant is sending an internal alarm. At the same time, some of these chemical signals are released into the air. Volatile organic compounds, green leaf volatiles, terpenes, compounds with names like cis-3-hexanyl acetate and beta-ocumene diffuse away from the damaged plant. Some of these volatiles attract predatory insects that feed on the herbivores attacking the plant. Others act as warning signals to neighboring plants of the same or different species. The neighbors, upon detecting these airborne signals, activate their own defensive gene expression. Their leaves, which have not been touched, become slightly more toxic to herbivores. Their tissues accumulate more of the compounds that will be needed if damage occurs. The attack has not reached them, but they are preparing for it. And then there is the underground component. The same chemical information that travels through the air can also travel in modified forms through the mycorrhizal network. Researchers have documented signal transfer through fungal networks that produces defensive responses in connected plants, even when those plants are isolated from each other, in ways that prevent any airborne communication. The signal is moving through the soil, through the biological cables that have been threading through the earth since the Devonian. They are preparing for something they cannot detect directly. They know about it only because a message arrived through the network, and they respond in a way that will increase their survival if the insects spread in their direction. Now let me bring in something that represents perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of what biological systems can do when they operate purely through chemistry, without any nervous system at all. And I warn you, it is going to feel like science fiction until you realize that it is not. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, the fungus that turns ants into zombies. That is not journalistic hyperbole. That is the most accurate short description of what this organism does. This species of parasitic fungus, found in tropical forests throughout South America and Southeast Asia, has evolved one of the most sophisticated behavioral manipulation systems in the natural world. Its host is a carpenter ant, and what it does to that ant is, biologically speaking, something that should not be possible. When an ant becomes infected with Ophiocordyceps spores, the fungus begins to grow through the ant's body. It infiltrates the muscles, it spreads through the soft tissues, and at a precisely timed moment, typically in the late morning, when temperature and humidity conditions are optimal for fungal spore dispersal, it manipulates the ant's behavior with a specificity that took researchers years to fully appreciate. The infected ant leaves its colony and climbs. It ascends a plant stem or a leaf, navigating to a very specific height, typically around 10 inches above the forest floor, research has found, and a very specific compass orientation, where the microclimate is precisely right for fungal growth. It then bites down on the underside of a leaf or stem with a force that locks its mandibles in a grip that will not release even after death. And then it dies, locked in place, precisely positioned. The fungal fruiting body erupts from the back of the ant's head, releases spores onto the forest floor below, and the cycle begins again. The precision here is what is staggering. The fungus is not simply triggering the ant to behave randomly or erratically. It is directing a specific, complex, multi-step behavior. Climb to a specific height, find a specific compass orientation, bite down on a specific type of substrate that serves the fungus's reproductive needs with remarkable efficiency. The ant is being operated as a vehicle by an organism with no brain and no nervous system. How does it do this? The mechanism is still being worked out, but scanning electron microscopy of infected ants shows that the fungus physically infiltrates the muscle fibers of the jaw muscles, surrounding each fiber in a web of hyphal cells. The ant's muscles appear to be being operated by direct mechanical and chemical control, largely bypassing the nervous system. The fungus is not hacking the ant's brain. It is replacing the brain's control of the ant's body with its own direct chemical control. It is acting as a substitute brain, directing complex, adaptive, precisely calibrated behavior in another organism, without itself possessing any of the neural structures we associate with behavioral control. No neurons, no brain. Behavioral control precise enough to position a dying animal at a specific height, in a specific orientation, on a specific substrate, at a specific time of day. Accomplished through chemistry, through the same fundamental toolkit: enzymes, metabolites, chemical signaling molecules, that fungi have been using since they first appeared on this planet. Now, let me bring in one more category of biological computation, because I want to be thorough before we move to the conclusion of this story. And this category lives not in the fungi, but in the plants themselves. Physarum polycephalum, the many-headed slime mold. Not a plant, not a fungus, but a member of the group called Myxomycetes, organisms that exist sometimes as individual amoeba-like cells and sometimes as large, unified, motile masses of merged cells that can span several feet. In this aggregate phase, Physarum has no brain, no nervous system, no sensory organs of any kind. It is, at the cellular level, just a mass of merged cells sharing a common cytoplasm. In 2010, a research team led by Toshiyuki Nakagaki at Hokkaido University published results of an experiment that became one of the most widely cited papers in modern biology. The team placed oat flakes on a flat surface in a spatial arrangement corresponding to the positions of 21 major cities around Tokyo, with the mass of each food source roughly proportional to the population of that city. They introduced a small portion of Physarum at the position corresponding to central Tokyo and allowed it to grow. Over approximately 26 hours, the slime mold extended filaments in all directions, found the food sources, and then progressively pruned back the connections that were redundant or inefficient while reinforcing the connections that were working well. The final network minimized total tube length, the minimum amount of biological material, while maintaining multiple redundant paths between major nodes. And when the researchers examined the result, they found that it bore a striking structural resemblance to the actual Tokyo rail network. The network that human engineers had spent decades designing and refining. This result was replicated with the highway systems of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Iberian Peninsula. In each case, the slime mold's network showed strong structural similarities to the human-engineered network. The underlying optimization logic was essentially the same. What mechanism produces this? It is physics. Cytoplasm flows more easily through wider tubes. Flow reinforces and widens those tubes. Tubes with little flow narrow and eventually disappear. Food sources produce chemical gradients that attract the growing network. These simple physical rules, playing out simultaneously across the entire body of the slime mold, produce a network topology that an engineer would recognize as sensible. The physicist calls it analog computation. The network is computing by doing physics, every component simultaneously calculating how much material flows through it and adjusting accordingly. The whole system, all at once, finds a near optimal solution. Computation without a processor. Intelligence without a location. A solution without a solver. Plants perform their own versions of biological computation. Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, learned in experiments by researcher Monica Galliano, published in 2014 to stop responding to a stimulus that had proven harmless. When dropped repeatedly from a small height with no resulting injury, the plants stopped folding their leaves in response. Habituation, the most basic form of learning, occurring in a plant with no nervous system. and the plants retained this learned behavior for weeks. No structure we associate with memory, memory nonetheless. The Venus flytrap counts. It requires 2 touches within approximately 20 seconds to trigger its trap closure, filtering out random debris or raindrops. At 5 further stimulations after closure, it ramps up enzyme production. At 10, it increases further. It calibrates its investment in digestion based on real-time information about the size and activity of its prey. Signal processing, logic gates, biological computation, optimizing predation success, with no neuron involved at any stage. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that plants are conscious. I am not claiming they have subjective experiences. What I am claiming, what the science shows, is that these organisms process information from their environments, integrate that information over time, and produce adaptive responses calibrated to that information. That is the functional definition of intelligence, stripped of the assumptions we imported because we built the definition in our own image. Now I want to take everything we have covered and bring it to the question we have been building toward since the beginning. Who is actually running this planet? Let me give you some numbers. There are approximately 3 trillion trees on Earth. 3 trillion. More than 300 times the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. More than 10,000 times the number of neurons in a human brain. Each one of those trees is, with very few exceptions, connected to a mycorrhizal network. The combined length of fungal filaments in just the top 4 inches of soil across the planet's land surface has been estimated at somewhere in the range of 500 million miles. 500 million miles of living, chemically active, nutrient-transporting, signal-passing biological cable, constantly remodeling itself, constantly responding to its environment. The total biomass of fungi on Earth, estimated at between 2 and 25 gigatons of carbon, is comparable, even at the lower bound, to the total biomass of all land animals combined. Fungi are not a minor component of the biosphere. They are one of its major structural elements. Now compare this to us. Homo sapiens has been on this planet for approximately 300,000 years. In that time, we have done genuinely remarkable things. We have developed language and writing and mathematics. We have mapped the genome and split the atom and traveled to the moon. We have built cities on every continent and networks of communication that span the globe. We have reshaped the planet in visible and dramatic ways. But fungi have been reshaping this planet for at least 1.3 billion years. Land plants have been reshaping it for at least 500 million years. The mycorrhizal partnership between them has been running continuously for 450 million years. Through every mass extinction, through every climate catastrophe, through the rise and fall of every dominant animal lineage this planet has ever seen. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the history of complex life. 5 events severe enough to eliminate the majority of species then living. The end Ordovician, approximately 445 million years ago. The late Devonian, roughly 375 million years ago. The end Permian, 252 million years ago. The worst of them all, which wiped out an estimated 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. An event so catastrophic it nearly ended the experiment of complex life on this planet entirely. The end Triassic and the end Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, which took the non-avian dinosaurs. Fungi survived all five. Land plants in various forms and assemblages survived all five. The mycorrhizal relationship survived all five. The end Permian extinction has been called, among paleomycologists, the greatest fungal bloom in Earth's history. While the ancestors of the dinosaurs were struggling to survive in a world that had just lost 96% of its species, fungi were having, in relative terms, a very good time. They were digesting the largest accumulation of dead organic material this planet had ever produced. This is not the survival of the lucky. This is the survival of the architecturally fundamental. Fungi are difficult to permanently destroy because they are not dependent on the complex, finely tuned physiological machinery that makes larger animals so fragile. They can reduce their metabolic activity to nearly zero and wait. They can survive radiation levels that would destroy most other organisms. They can survive desiccation. They can survive temperature extremes. They are robust because their architecture is simple, distributed, and redundant. If you destroy part of the network, the rest continues. There is no single point of failure. We, by contrast, are elaborate, complex, precisely tuned to a narrow range of temperature, oxygen concentration, humidity, and atmospheric composition. We are extraordinary, but we are fragile in the ways that all elaborate, precisely tuned things are fragile. The mycorrhizal network is not a relic. It is not something that peaked hundreds of millions of years ago and has been coasting ever since. Right now, today, it is the primary mechanism by which most terrestrial plants access phosphorus, the element without which DNA cannot be synthesized, without which protein cannot be built, without which life as we know it cannot function. Right now, today, these networks are transporting carbon between trees, routing chemical warning signals across forests, modulating the growth of plant communities in ways that shape the water cycle, and through the water cycle, the regional climate. And we are, right now, degrading that system at a rate that has no precedent in its long history. The use of synthetic phosphorus fertilizers in industrial agriculture has, in many cases, reduced or eliminated the mycorrhizal associations in crop plants. Why would a plant invest in maintaining a fungal partnership when phosphorus is being delivered directly to its roots in abundance? The relationship atrophies, the network degrades, and the soil beneath those fields loses the biological infrastructure that took millions of years to build. Topsoil, the biologically active layer that the mycorrhizal network builds and maintains, and that makes agriculture possible, takes roughly 1,000 years to form 1 inch of new material under natural conditions. 1 inch, 1,000 years. Industrial farming practices in many regions are depleting topsoil at rates many times faster than that. We are removing in decades what the mycorrhizal networks of the Devonian and Carboniferous took millions of years to construct. I am not here to deliver a lecture about agriculture. That is not the point. The point is this. We are removing infrastructure we do not fully understand, that we did not build, and that we cannot quickly replace. And we are doing it with the confidence of people who believe that our kind of intelligence, fast, intentional, technologically mediated, is the only kind that matters. The science we have covered today says otherwise. Here is what strikes me most about the contrast between these two kinds of intelligence. And this is where I'm going to give you my honest perspective. Because you have been patient enough to follow this story for a long time, and you deserve the author's actual view. We have spent the last several thousand years, our entire civilization, essentially, operating on the assumption that intelligence is what separates us from nature, that the capacity for thought, for planning, for language, for technology makes us something categorically different from the rest of the biological world. That we are the product of evolution, but have somehow transcended it. That we are now the thing that directs the process, rather than being subject to it. This assumption is seductive because it is partly true. We are genuinely different. Our capacity for abstract language, for cumulative culture, the ability to pass knowledge across generations and have each generation build on what came before, is unique among the organisms we know. No other species on this planet has done what we have done with knowledge. The science in this video, the ability to trace carbon through an underground fungal network using radioactive isotopes, the ability to understand evolutionary dynamics across geological time, the ability to recognize the Tokyo rail network in the behavior of a slime mold, all of this is a product of that cumulative culture. It is remarkable. I want to be clear about that. But the assumption breaks down when we use it to make a different and far more consequential claim. That because we are uniquely intelligent, the systems around us that lack our kind of intelligence are therefore passive, inert, and available for unlimited exploitation. That because the forest does not plan, it can be treated as if it has no relevant internal organization. That because the soil does not intend anything, its integrity does not matter. That because fungi and plants do not know they are doing anything, we can safely ignore what they do. The history we have covered today is a systematic rebuttal to that claim. These systems are not passive. They are not inert. They have internal organization of extraordinary sophistication, refined across timescales that dwarf anything our civilization has experienced. They do things that matter for our survival, that we cannot currently replicate with technology. They build soil at timescales of 1,000 years per inch. They fix nitrogen through biological pathways we are still working to understand and replicate at scale. They regulate water cycles through forest transpiration in ways that influence continental rainfall patterns. They maintain the chemical balance of the atmosphere through the same photosynthesis decomposition cycle that they have been running since the Carboniferous. When we degrade these systems, and we are degrading them globally, measurably, at accelerating rates, we are not simply destroying scenery. We are dismantling infrastructure. Infrastructure that we depend on, and that we cannot rebuild on any timeline that matters to a civilization. The mycorrhizal network beneath an old-growth forest took thousands of years to develop its current complexity. When that forest is cleared, the network collapses within years. The soil that took 10,000 years to build begins to erode. The carbon stored in the soil begins to return to the atmosphere. The water cycle that the forest maintained begins to shift. All of this happens not because of any malice or intention in the system, but because removing the biological foundation removes the processes that built and maintained everything above it. Cause and effect, as simple and as irreversible as that. We know all of this. The science is not ambiguous. And yet the degradation continues because we operate on timescales of quarters and election cycles and human lifetimes. While the system we are degrading operate on timescales of centuries and millennia and geological epochs, our intelligence, remarkable as it is, has an inherent temporal limitation. We are very good at solving problems in the near future, and very poor at acting on threats that are certain but distant. The fungi have no such problem. They have no sense of time at all. They simply respond to their current conditions, optimize toward immediate chemical equilibrium, and accumulate the results over geological time. It is not wisdom. It is not foresight. It is simply the absence of the impatience that causes us to discount the future so heavily relative to the present. And paradoxically, that absence produces a kind of long-term stability that our kind of intelligence has yet to demonstrate at civilizational scales. Here is a thought experiment. Imagine you are a visitor from elsewhere, arriving at Earth for the first time and looking for signs of intelligence, not assuming intelligence looks like technology, looking for the functional signatures, organized information processing, resource allocation, long-distance communication, adaptive response to environmental challenges, long-term stability, resilience against catastrophic failure. You scan the surface. You notice a species, Homo sapiens, that has built remarkable structures, developed complex communication systems, and demonstrated extraordinary technological capability in a very short period. Impressive. But you also notice that this species has, within a few centuries of developing its most powerful technologies, significantly destabilized the atmospheric chemistry, depleted large fractions of its resource base, and shown recurring difficulty coordinating effectively at the global scale. Impressive local performance. Uncertain systemic stability. Young, you note. Very, very young. Then you look underground. You find a network spanning every continent, 450 million years old, that runs on a chemical communication protocol refined across geological time, maintains the nutrient flows that sustain the vast majority of terrestrial life, modulates the atmospheric chemistry of the entire planet, and has survived every catastrophic event this planet has produced. A network with no central control, no single point of failure, and a track record of continuous operation through conditions that have repeatedly driven other lineages to extinction. Which system looks more intelligent to you? That should give us pause. Not despair. Pause. The kind of thoughtful pause that precedes a better decision than the one you would have made without it. The fungi were here before us. in all probability, they will be here after us, not as rivals, not as conquerors, not as anything that has an opinion about us in any direction, simply as what they have always been, the patient, invisible, chemically sophisticated architects of the living world, the ones who made the soil, ran the networks, shaped the atmosphere, and kept the whole system running while the animals, including us, came and went in what, from a geological perspective, amounts to the blink of an eye. Having traveled through 450 million years of history, from bare Ordovician rock to the towering alien forests of the Carboniferous, from the first chemical partnerships in the first thin films of proto-soil to the slime mold that replicated the Tokyo rail system in 26 hours, from the counting Venus flytrap to the learning mimosa to the zombie ant fungus directing the final act of its host's life with surgical precision. I hope the answer feels less like a provocation now and more like a description. A description of how this planet actually operates, as opposed to how we have usually imagined it. The mycorrhizal network is real. The Wood Wide Web is real. The chemical warning signals that travel between trees under attack are real. The Carboniferous carbon burial that produced our coal and shaped our atmosphere is real. The biological computation performed by organisms with no neurons is real. These are not metaphors. They are documented, replicated, peer-reviewed facts about the biology of the world we live in. And they all point toward the same conclusion. Life does not require a brain to be complex, adaptive, communicative, or consequential. The biological systems we tend to overlook, the ones beneath our feet, in the dark, operating in the slow language of chemistry, are not simply supporting our world. In a very real sense, they built it, and they are still running it. The most important thing that follows from understanding all of this is a specific kind of humility. Not the false humility that dismisses human achievement. We have done extraordinary things and should own that honestly. But the genuine humility that comes from recognizing that we entered a system that was already running with extraordinary competence, that we do not fully understand that system, and that our continued well-being depends on its continued function. We have spent centuries trying to replace biological systems with technological ones. Some of that replacement has been necessary and has saved enormous numbers of lives, but some of it has been based on the assumption that because we can replace something, we understand it well enough to do so safely. The history we have covered today suggests that assumption deserves much more careful examination than it has received. The fungi are not asking for anything from us. They do not need our recognition or our gratitude. They were managing this planet for 400 million years before we appeared, and the geological record strongly suggests they will be managing it long after we are gone. But we exist within their system. We breathe the oxygen their forests helped produce over geological time. We eat food grown in soil their networks built over millions of years. We are, whether we acknowledge it or not, participants in a biological conversation that began long before our species and will continue long after it. Paying attention to that conversation seems like the minimum we can do.